Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is the co-host, Daniel McAdams. And Daniel, nice to see you.
Good morning, Dr. Paul.
Well, good. We have just a simple little problem to solve today. There was a little bit of violence in Chicago, and who would have ever thought it would come to blows in just a, calm, collected political campaign and a season where everybody loves each other. And here they're getting fists are flying, accusations are made. It looks like it could get worse, and brought back memories for me and others about 1968, which there were a lot of violence in the Democratic convention. It didn't do them much good in their election either. But the question is, who's at fault? Most of the time people say, well, it takes two to make a fight, but sometimes it takes one guy or one person or one group to really stir things up. So do you think there's any chance that we could pick one side or the other and say, well, all the blame lies on him, he or they started it, and therefore they're at fault? Or is this going to be a tough one?
It's a tough one. As anyone who watches the show knows, there's not a lot of defense going on for Donald Trump on the program. And it is very hard to defend because, his rhetoric, you've talked about it. But, of all people, and thanks to Bob Wenzel for putting this up, but Karl Rove over the weekend, who may dislike Trump even more than you do, but he made a good point. He said, and this is about the disruptors whose point is to prevent these rallies from happening for Donald Trump. Not to protest, but to prevent them. And he said, do what you want outside the rally, do what you want outside the hall in a peaceful fashion, but to have an organized aim to break up a rally before it happens, he said, strikes me as fundamentally un-American.
And the group, MoveOn.org, is very suspect when you think of George Soros and his allegiance to Obamacare and Obama's wars. You just wonder. And I think Obama, the MoveOn.org says there's going to be more of this. Yeah. So that is something, has to be considered on exactly where they're coming from. But all of a sudden, when I see this violence in the streets and in this campaign, I think of the 1960s because, as bad as it is now, the 60s were really bad. I hope it never gets like that. But the real fight over there was over the Vietnam War and civil liberties and all. So I think about Martin Luther King. What would he do? He certainly wouldn't be with Trump. The way Trump talks and, defames people and the language he uses. And I think he is a xenophobe and this kind of thing. But he wouldn't endorse that. But I don't think he'd be with, and I guess it's not fair for me to assume that I know what Martin Luther King was, but from his history and from what he's written, I don't think he would have been saying, let's go, I want to be with you, let's see if we can start a fight, because I think he honestly thought he could achieve more through peaceful resistance and civil disobedience, and I think he did achieve a lot. But he would have probably spoken out, and like was suggested in your opening statement, that maybe demonstrating in a peaceful manner and saying, this is unbecoming of candidates running for president, but I don't think he would have been an advocate of MoveOn.org.
Yeah, and it's interesting that when the other presidential candidates were given the opportunity to condemn this kind of infiltration, and the Democrat candidates as well, they all took the opportunity to blame it all on Trump. And of course, you talked about the rhetoric. Certainly there's blame to go around, and he does have divisive rhetoric, but I think it strikes me as somewhat cowardly for someone like Cruz and Rubio just to score political points to endorse this kind of behavior, this kind of breaking up of rallies.
Yeah, and they, of course, are being purely political. If they can score a point and knock down Trump, that's the goal of political campaigns. But I just don't see it being very easy to say that it was all Trump's fault or all the others' fault. But I have to say that he has never pleased me with his rhetoric. That's Trump's rhetoric, because I think it's over the top. But what bothered me the most was not to know about a Trump and know people who believe this and know people who would speak out. But what bothered me is why so many people were loving it. Yeah, I think it's all the Mexican fault, and foreigners, and it's trade, and we need more sanctions and more tariffs, and all stuff that I don't believe in getting such strong support. But I always have looked at this as frustration and blaming the wrong things. I haven't even come across actually blaming the right thing. I mean, if it's bad economic policies, if it's Keynesianism, if it's the Federal Reserve, and all these other things that have caused class distinctions and the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer, this talk of finding scapegoats. Even in the last, when I was running in the presidential campaign, I thought there was too much danger of scapegoating, immigrants. Even though I wasn't favorable for, open borders and easy citizenship and welfare benefits for everybody not for that, but I was still thinking things are going to get bad and they're going to have to blame somebody. And I think Trump is doing this and actually really aggravating the conflict rather than raising the discourse. Yeah. And didn't he have a statement that said that it was partially Sanders' fault?
Yeah, well, he said that Sanders was lying when he says that he didn't encourage his people to go to these rallies, and there may be some truth to that. Who knows? But if Sanders is encouraging this, it's going to backfire because I think this kinds of thing is only going to deepen people's support for Trump. The idea that he's standing up to these groups.
Well, where I see the hypocrisy is that everybody's expressing, disapproval of the violence. MoveOn.org, they're violent people. They come in here and disrupt, and they ruin they're taking away our First Amendment rights. And then, of course, Trump's side uses rhetoric too. But I don't see this having very much, if anything, to do with First Amendment rights. I mean, everybody has a right to express themselves. They don't have a right to use violence. But I think it's the messy situation that we have with property rights is the problem, because when you think of nitpicking all the civil liberties in colleges and who carries guns, who don't, and where you speak and what you can say. If you go to a private school, you don't have that problem. You might go to a school that's sort of authoritarian or have different views, but it's not a big problem if it's private property. And if all these venues were privately owned, Trump would have, or any candidate would have the authority, to run them as they see fit, and they don't need people that are coming in to demonstrate. And if they don't screen them, if they're there, they should have a plan how you take them out. And to say that, you're not permitting us to have our First Amendment rights, that's sort of like somebody going into a particular church evangelizing for some other religion is completely different. They don't have the right to do that. So I think it's the fuzziness of First Amendment rights, and people can't come into houses and do anything. And as a matter of fact, the Second Amendment, if I decide that you carry a gun, so to speak, I can exclude you from my house if you have a gun. So we do have, rights that can handle this, but you have to have respect for the for property rights, and that's where I think we really fall down on understanding how many of these problems can be solved with property rights and contracts.
I think, unfortunately, maybe I'm wrong, but maybe a general dumbing down of the population in a way, because the idea of the First Amendment has come to mean I get to say whatever I want, wherever I want to say it, and you better not stop me because you're bothering my First Amendment rights.
And then it also gets to the point where if you don't say something politically correct, they will silence you. So this is political incorrectness that they're trying to silence. But once again, I think it should be settled someplace else. But violence, of course, a good libertarian rejects the use of violence to bring about social and political changes. And you don't commit aggression, you don't initiate aggression. And most of the time, you can figure this out. This may be a little messy, but most of the time you can figure out who the aggressor is. But right now, in spite of this mess, like I said, it's nothing like the violence and the killing of the 60s. But the individuals doing most of the criticism, both left and right, about the violence, never stop for a minute to consider how violent they are. See, what I'd like to have are more people concerned about the violence of their foreign policy. Just think of preemptive war and drones and occupations killing innocent people, and even Trump's statement, about if you have an ISIS suspect, you kill the families too. That kind of stuff is not nonviolent. And yet both sides, Republicans worse than the Democrats for the most part, on the use of force in war. The Democrats, I would say, are more sneaky about it, because even when you elect the peace candidate like Obama, do the wars stop?
Yeah, and it's someone like Hillary Clinton has zero credibility when it comes to it. As you say, the rhetoric of punch him in the nose and this sort of thing is unpleasant. It's horribly unpleasant. But what about someone like Hillary Clinton, who's crying crocodile tears over what's happening? Oh, it's all Trump's fault for inciting. Here's a woman whose idea of foreign policy is to invade and bomb Libya. Thousands were killed because of her pushing for this war. Remember, she said, "We came, we saw, he died." And someone like Bernie Sanders, who voted for the intervention in Libya as well. There are actions that cause other people to die. And I think those are, and we talked about this earlier, those are far more serious than someone's rhetoric, even if it's ill-chosen.
They're not talking about that issue, of course. But the fact that they believe in that issue, it may spill over and make them more comfortable talking and blaming on conflict, and almost like to avoid the big issues. And to me, the big issue is government force and government violence. They never for a minute say, well, two private groups can be arguing and fighting and they might have to be broken up. But it's the government violence. It's not only the government violence in foreign policy that we follow, but what about the government violence? Bernie Sanders supports a political system that is based on violence, vicious violence by the government, because it's forced redistribution of wealth, which undermines productivity. It creates more poor people, and the use of the Federal Reserve to redistribute wealth. And it's only done by force, because if you don't pay your taxes to support welfare redistribution, what happens? You go to jail, and sometimes you go to jail for long, long periods of time, especially if you argue against that form of taxation on a principle that it's morally wrong and unconstitutional. That's politically incorrect and politically very dangerous, and we do know of individuals going to prison only because they talked about this and why the force of government is unconstitutional and very violent. So It's to me, if you look at all the gun violence, it's the government gun violence, which is the greatest threat to me and to peace and prosperity.
Yeah, absolutely. The other thing I was just going to mention is how troubling it is. George Soros has spent millions, hundreds of millions of dollars overthrowing governments overseas, and how he does it is he gets small groups of people who protest, often very violently, to overthrow and thwart the will of the majority. And we saw this in places like Ukraine and elsewhere. But I find it very, very troubling to see organizations that he sponsors here who are trying to do the same thing. Trump is at the top right now on the Republican side, and for better or for worse, people are attracted to him. And to attempt to take small groups and use force and intimidation tactics to overturn the will of these people, to maybe frighten them from going out to vote, is sort of like bringing the color revolutions home to the U.S.
I think so. Is a danger. I think this issue of taunting is an interesting subject, because, there can be a position where you are committing violence with the threat of violence, pointing a gun. You haven't committed the violence, you haven't shot anybody, but it's the threat of violence and clear violence. Now, when Trump was defending one of his supporters who did the punching, he said, well, I'll even defend you in court, But then Trump threw it out. He says, well, I understand that he might have been taunted or was taunted, by the individuals and threatening. And besides, he was pro-ISIS, this sort of thing. But taunting, gets awfully close. And I think there may be times you think the ultimate taunting and the temptation to try to force somebody to do something is important. But I think if there's confusion, I say err on the side of not putting the blame on it. But if it's very clear, if somebody comes in and they're using a gun and they're threatening you, you don't, that is the use of force, even though they haven't actually committed force or injury yet. So I think taunting becomes subjective, and yet, once again, I think the solution is going to be treat it like our homes. But the far left and the right has already accepted the idea that it's public property and public rights, and it's in the interest of national security. It's in the interest of the public, and therefore, it gets very, very confusing. When this property is owned by individuals, it's a lot different. I think the argument of property is something that can be used for our immigration problems, because if people come in and invade we know they can't come into our houses, but they come into our country, they go on to welfare benefits, then the taxes go up, and you're exposed because there's so much public space. But in a truly libertarian society, people who came into a country would have to occupy private property, and they'd have to be invited, and there would have to be an agreement on this. So it's a shame that we don't have the respect that we should have for private property, but that, of course, is undermined by the far left, and the right is not such a good. They don't do such a good job either on property rights. But I think that the issue of property rights is pretty important.
Well, let's hope this thing tones down.
Yeah, that's what we're looking for. And since we didn't find one group that we can place all the blame on, I hope this will help a little bit. But it is violence is bad. Violence is especially bad when it's initiated by one group or another. But government is the most violent of them all. And this is petty violence, but very, very serious. But I think it's a reflection of a lot of problem, a lot of fear, which is motivated and promoted by the candidates, and with a lack of understanding, a lack of concern and understanding of how our foreign policy creates, the fear of ISIS, and why the lack of understanding of the Federal Reserve and monetary policy allows our economy to go to shambles. And then the argument comes, who's doing this? Don't we just have to tax the rich even more? And they don't understand it, but they know the problems are out there, and I think the anger is going to grow, unfortunately, because they are not addressing the real issue, and the real issue is that of liberty and property and nonviolence. Hopefully someday we will understand this, and we at this studio will continue to promote the cause of liberty and peace. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report, and please come back soon.